Next session, which will be starting momentarily, is we have two great USY leaders. Stephanie Sussman is a high school student from Los Angeles, California. Steph grew up at Valley Beth Shalom and Camp Ramon, California. Yay, oh, hi. She's currently serving as USY Far West Regional and also the International Religion and Education Vice President. That's awesome. We're looking forward to learning from you. Stephanie is a grand prize winner of Jewish Rock Radio's Jewish Star Season 2. Sarah Hasson is a high school student from Fairfax, Virginia. So we got like the two coasts covered. She grew up at Congregation Olam Tikva, and she currently serves as the Seaboard USY Region President and USY International Convention Co-Chair. And we are really looking forward to learning from both of you. Yeah, thank you both. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi Gideon. Hi again, everyone. My name is Steph Sussman. I use she, her pronouns. I am from LA. I am the International Rel-Ed. And I am very, very excited to be joined here by my very good friend Sarah, all the way from the East Coast. So she's up at 1 a.m. with me at 10. So we'll see how that the cognitive brain function works in the different time zones. We're really pushing it.
Yeah, so my name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. Obviously, I'm from Fairfax, Virginia, as was just said by both of the people before me. And we're so excited to talk about this.
So, a broad statement about what we're learning about tonight. We're talking about gender in Genesis, but a little bit more specifically, our like guiding statement is how does the understanding of the original Genesis text and its interpretations influence our current understanding of gender and gender roles in the modern day? So we have a couple different sources that we're going to talk about along the way, but we want to start at the very beginning. A very good place to start if you're a fan of the sound of music. And we're going to start in chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. Sarah, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, so we're starting obviously with a very memorable part of the Torah. We're starting with chapter 1, line 26. We create man. We create man B'Tselem in God's image. And this is a really first time understanding humanity. And at this point, we do not have any gender associated with man or humanity, right? And then immediately after, within the next line, line 27, we go to God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Then male and female, he created them. When you read this statement, it's a little odd. You're like, whoa, what just happened? We created him. We created a man. Then we create male and female. We created them. So what is happening here? It's kind of an oddly phrased statement. But there are many different interpretations, one of which being that the male and female is just establishing a singular being that embodies both male and female.
Right. And something really interesting that we discussed when we were first talking about this text is the various different translations that we read of the original text and what specific diction they wanted to use in that interpretation. Because anytime we read a translation, it is an interpretation of someone else's view on the text. So in some instances, we read man and woman, and in some other instances, we read male and female. I found that really interesting because man and woman have like societal connotations attached to them and very specific gender roles, whereas male and female, while still very gendered terms, can usually be considered a little more medical and a little more sterile and a little less charged. And we both found that very interesting in the different texts that we read. But one expansion upon this that we really liked is on our last page of our source sheet, by Dr. Gwen Kessler. If Sarah, you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so Dr. Gwen Kessler, she is a graduate of JTS and had this amazing article that we found, and we're just obsessed with the teaching in it. She talks about Genesis Rabbah, and talks about this idea of the first human being a golem, perhaps. She mentions perhaps undifferentiated, perhaps an ungendered being. It's created in God's image, which provides us a model of God, a idea for our omnipotent creator, who is above, like how God is above time, above the world, and above all knowledge. God is also, we're assuming, above and transcending gender altogether. There's a little pun there, transcends gender, transgender. This is just such an interesting perspective because we really have such a distinct discussion of God in the text, using he, him pronouns. But this kind of presents a perspective that we might interpret it in the modern day as being more similar to our perspective of an androgynous or non-binary person. And there are many different pronouns used over time for non-binary people. And it's so interesting to have this image of a gender neutral God.
So true. I think it's very interesting. But as the text continues, I have a little bit of an anecdote. A couple of days ago, I was studying with my rabbi, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who I was very happy to see on here earlier. But I was studying with him, and I was like, Rabbi, what does this one line mean later in the text? And he goes, well, we've got to backtrack first. So chapter 1, he says chapter 1 of Genesis is like this basic overseeing version of the creation story. And chapter 2 really dives into the specifics. So the verse that we read earlier, in chapter 1:27, which we found a little bit ambiguous, we can really dive deep into in chapter 2. So before we dive in, we kind of wanted to talk about, is chapter 2 a continuation of chapter 1? Is it a linear story? Or is it like a point of view change and a retelling and a diving deeper? So now we're going to jump into a little bit of a Talmudic conversation about this story. And it talks about Adam and Eve's first day on earth and how it's divided into 12 hours. So in the first hour, we see Adam and Eve, or Adam turned into clay. The second, like a mass. The third, the limbs extending. The fourth, infused with the soul. The fifth, he stands on his feet. And the sixth, he goes to name all of creation. And it's this first half of the day, we see all these details about Adam being built up and created. And then suddenly in the seventh, out of nowhere, Eve exists. And that's a little strange. Sarah and I both agreed that we spent all this time building up to this moment, and then suddenly there's another person. We spent 6 hours on one person, and then where'd this other one come from? Sarah, do you want to expand on that a little?
Yeah, we were both discussing how odd it is that our first introduction to womanhood and our first introduction to an actual being that is not a man is just so short and so underdeveloped. Adam has these hours of becoming this individual being who has like in all of these different parts of his soul and his being are being created, and then Eve is just boom. Okay, it took a sec. Eve just exists, and suddenly, and in the same sentence that we mention Eve for the first time in the Talmud, Eve is also immediately becoming his mate. We say Eve, the first time Eve is mentioned in this Talmudic interpretation, Eve becomes his mate. immediately, as if women cannot exist in the Torah, or as the Torah interpreted by these um, rabbis at the time, without being the mate of a man, which is so interesting.
Right. And I really think this matters because for so long throughout our history, this story in particular largely informed our understanding of gender and gender roles in our society. And we understand that Eve exists, but she's never really given the spotlight until she like does something wrong. And women exist outside of the capacity of doing something wrong. And as we continue, we're gonna go to chapter 2, verses 15 through 25. And really, we've talked about this text. We've kind of walked around it, but we're actually gonna speak of it now. Sarah.
Yeah, so 225 is the unpacking of the story of how we really get to Eve, and how Adam exists in the garden. So first we have Adam being placed there by God, taking care of the garden. Then we have God telling the story of the tree, the whole deal. You're probably very familiar with this story. Then we go on. The wild beasts are here. Adam gets to name them, and eventually we come to the conclusion. Adam needs a fitting helper, and Adam gets put to sleep. We have Eve get brought out of the flesh. But the lines that really stick out are the two relating to our understanding of gender are the idea of a fitting helper, and the idea of when the man is created, how he interacts with the woman or Eve.
Right. So the first instance of this we see in verse 18. It says, "The Lord said, 'It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him.'" And when I initially asked my rabbi about verse 22 or 24, sorry, when I initially asked my rabbi about verse 24, he goes, "We have to talk about verse 18. We have to talk about Ezer Kenegdo, a fitting partner, a fitting helper, because we frame this person for Adam. We frame this pair as not as a helper and as a partner. And a partner implies that they're like equally footed. They're equally of each other. And sorry, I just totally lost the words. But it implies that they are equals. But and then in 24, it goes on to say, "Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so that they become one flesh." So then we're reading this moral of the story where like it has stopped telling us the story of Adam and Eve and kind of the Torah has inserted itself to like tell us the moral of everything that's happening. And said, "Hence a man," and to give us this very male-centric view of how to operate in the world. And I think it's particularly fitting for people in a scenario like Sarah and I, who are both graduating seniors and both about to go to college. And we're expected to go into the world and go find a partner, go find a mate. And I think it's particularly interesting for someone like me. I like openly identify as someone who is not heterosexual, and like how am I supposed to feel as someone who's like reading this text and is like, wait, a man is supposed to come and find me, and like I'm supposed to cling to him, and we're supposed to like, that's not something I enjoy. Like, Sarah, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's really it can be really frustrating to read some of these sections, honestly, because I think it establishes women existing, and then suddenly men immediately have to cling to them, and women are not defined as individuals at all. And as we want to, as teens like us are going off to college, it can be very scary to feel like our future might be defined by whatever partner we may have. Um, it also is fascinating that the line says, hence a man leaves his mother and father. Okay, a woman could be a mother and a man could be a father, and clings to his wife. So a woman, at this point, a man can exist as an individual and as a father, but a woman has only ever existed in this context as a mother and a wife, a partner, but she's never existed fully as an individual, which is a little gross to think about if you think about
and
it.
the first opportunity given to be free of that role is when she does something bad. Is when she goes and like disrespects the word of God, which is like obviously not something that happens to everyone. And I something we touched upon earlier is like what is the purpose of like the Torah for humanity to exist? It's like it's a set of morals, it's a set of beliefs, it's a set of rules to live by to survive, right? That's how Jews got through the Black Plague. That's how we washed our hands. We had kosher meat, whatever. And like if we read it that way, we're reading for survival, right? The humans needed to have a wife. The men needed to have a wife so they could have kids, so the Jewish people could thrive and prosper and continue to survive. But obviously that's not the way the world exists anymore. And how do we take these texts that like have affected us so deeply and turn them into something positive? And I think we find that in one of our other sources, which is from Rabbi Michael Lerner. And in an article he wrote about gender and Genesis when we were researching, he quotes the line, Yotzer uvrechoshech, who creates light and shapes darkness in the present tense, and talks about creation within an ongoing process, and then quotes his teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who we, of course, love in USY with our Heschel chairs. But we say, humans are potentially partners with God in healing the transformation of the world, Tikkun Olam, because creation is not yet finished. We are here in part to do what we can, enabled by being B'Tselem in the image. So I think we can take this teaching from Heschel and take it a step further and say, not only is like the creation process not done, but also our understanding of gender and gender roles and the creation of gender in itself is not done either. And I think that's a very interesting implication to explore. We've got like so many different things in the world that have changed between when the Torah was written and now. And I think that it's just like remarkable that we come to a point where we can like acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you want to expand on that in any way?
Yeah. I think it's fascinating because I think it's really easy for us, I think, and I find myself doing this as well as I find some of my older peers, and older family members doing this as well, as wanting to, when there's something that is new and scary, kind of shutting down And especially when it comes to gender, I think that gender is so, like we said, it's so ingrained in our society of this idea of how women interact with men and how women act as kind of these maternal wifely figures, and men are individuals who get to really grow and develop. And we haven't fully explored in between that binary until relatively recently, if we consider all of time. And I think that really, this concept that creation is still occurring and the world is still changing, really provides us the opportunity to change as people and grow with our Jewish community instead of against it. Um, if we're assuming that all humans are created b'Tselem, that means even the humans that are created who choose to use different pronouns that you might anticipate, or choose to identify with a gender that you may not assume that they are right for, they are still made in the image of God. And I think that's such a powerful, amazing concept that is just so beautiful, that we are all constantly changing, and our concept of gender is constantly changing. Our concept of gender roles are constantly changing. If you think back to even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the jobs and professions that many women are performing were not the same. And it's so interesting that creation can still develop in such a unique way as we get to witness.
Right. I think that is really like the essence of what we wanted to talk about today. We are a little bit early, and our next people are not here yet, I believe. Rabbi Gideon, am I correct?
You guys do still have 8 more minutes, but
Very cool.
We can keep talking. We got lots to say.
You guys can keep talking. You guys got plenty more time. And I just want to say you guys are doing great. Like,
Thanks.
this is fascinating.
One thing that we talked about when we were going on our little tangents earlier about this text is again verse 24, which we talked about earlier, where the Torah like inserts itself. And we compared it to kind of like the director's cut of a movie. It was kind of like the Torah was like, hey, remember that one part, like a director in a movie is like, hey, remember that painting in the background of that one scene that you like could barely see? This is where it matters. This is where it comes into play. And that's where the Torah is kind of like, hey, here's the moral of the story. Don't want you to miss that. And I think it's so interesting how like in your face the Torah is about what it wants you to think and what it wants you to believe. And yet here we are so many generations later, still talking about it, still learning about it. Obviously this whole night is just learning Torah. And there's so many times when it's like, here's the moral, here's the thing we want you to believe, but we can still find all of these things that we find fascinating and interesting and still have conversations about. Sarah?
Yeah, especially in that specific line. So we just talked about how women exist, and we've taken out from the flesh of my flesh, the rib, all of that, and then it's like the director. It's God. It's the Torah whispering. Hence, a man leaves his father and clings to his wife, so that they become one flesh. That one flesh thing is is amazing, because we obviously we want everyone to be an individual, but it is so interesting that it kind of provides this idea of soulmates almost, and this idea of like connections that is really essential to human beings, and really essential to understanding, and also understanding that connection, soulmates, whether you believe it platonically or romantically, or just having someone to connect to and becoming one with them, is not limited to between a man and a woman. It's just becoming one flesh, and that is such a pure and beautiful concept.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of my favorite lines is is about the Ezer Kenegdo, your fitting helper, and how what does it mean in the modern day to have an Ezer Kenegdo, and when my rabbi asked this question, what do you want in a friend? What do you want in a person that you spend a lot of time with? My first response was like, someone who gets my sense of humor. someone who like, not necessarily someone I agree with all the time, because when you agree with someone all the time, it's boring. When you like my comparison I made earlier when talking about pop culture things, big fan of How I Met Your Mother, and the olive theory, which is brought up at the beginning, if anyone is familiar. But basically, if you're not, one person really dislikes olives and the other person really likes olives. So that person can have the other person's olives. And I think if we want to take this, like, this text that we've kind of been negative about the whole time, we can make it positive. Like, Eve was made for Adam, and they didn't always agree on everything. Maybe they weren't always the best of husband and wife, but they were perfect in the sense of they were fitting helpers for each other. And I think that's a very sweet message to kind of get out of this text. If you didn't get anything else out of the text about gender that we talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Also, I love that the idea that it's interpreted many different, going back to the thing about who translates the text, kind of picks the words that we use and picks the definitions that we operate off of. A fitting helper is a completely different power structure than a fitting partner, right? Like, a helper, I think of a helper as somebody maybe below you or directly above you who's coming to, like, either an assistant or like your boss who's coming to like give you a little help when you can't figure it out. Like, there's a power structure there where partner is much more even, in a much more even playing field. And I would really hope that we, in our modern day relationships, try and seek that partnership and try and seek that even playing field, whether it be in our relationships or in just life. Because for so long, we were so defined by the one interpretation of the text, by the one interpretation of the Hebrew that said there is an uneven power struggle. There is a helper and a person who is in control. And by eliminating that structure and just saying, no, they're partners, they're equals, they're equal in the eyes of God, they're both made in God's image, it allows us to have individual perspectives on them, individual perspectives on well-developed women that have been ignored through all of history, for men that may have been not as important to the actual events taking place. Yeah, it's just so interesting. This whole piece is so interesting to dive into.
As we wrap up, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to come speak to all of you, and I'm very excited to pass it off to Rabbi Gideon to transition us to the next speakers.
I just wanted to thank Steph and Sarah. That was an amazing teaching, really exploring the complexity and like, I feel that we are served well by your leadership of what you're doing for USY, and I wish you both much success as you transition to college, and congratulations on finishing your senior years, and thank you for sharing your Torah with all of us.
Yeah, hey, Gideon. I wish I could have been a part of that conversation. That seemed amazing, just from my perspective. Can I chime in one quick thought before you transition to me? Is that okay? Because I was really
Sure.
super interested in that. Okay, so if you have a chance, by the way, I'm Dan Stein. I use he/him pronouns. Gideon's going to introduce me in a second. But Alana Pardes, who's a professor of Bible at Hebrew University and studied with Robert Alter at Cal, he says the key is the first verse of, or she says the key is the first verse of Genesis chapter 4, where Eve says, "I made a child with God." And Adam isn't even around at the second half of that verse. So just one thing to maybe think about where Adam goes in chapter 4 might be a great place to continue that conversation. But that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Sarah and Steph, and I wish you guys all the best. Now it is my great pleasure to pass off emceeing duties to my classmate and dear friend, Rabbi Daniel Stein, who is a rabbi in Walnut Creek, California, who is much earlier than it is here in Houston. Thank you.
And, can you not leave yet for a second? Get on the book before I introduce it. Yeah, just stay here for 1 second.
No, I'm fine. Wait,
okay, great. So here's the deal. People might not know that Gideon has, Rabbi Estes has the best laugh in the rabbinical assembly. So what I thought I might do, I'm not very funny, but we had instructions that we were supposed to be entertaining when we were the hosts. So I try to take those instructions seriously. So I got my big book of Jewish humor, and I have one joke for Rabbi Estes to see if I can make him laugh. And my wife approved it. She says that it's not in poor taste. So that's important. Okay. An elderly Jewish couple on their way to vacation in Hawaii got in an argument about the correct pronunciation of Hawaii. He was sure that it was Hawaii, but she maintained that it was Hawaii. As soon as they got off the plane, they ran over to the very first person they saw. "Hi there," the husband said. "Would you mind telling me how you pronounce the name of these islands?" "Hawaii," the man replied. "Thank you," the husband said, gloating. "You're welcome," the man replied. Okay, okay, it worked. Now you can leave, my dear friend. It's nice. It's nice to see you. Thank you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our very next speaker in our Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Sorry, I have my notes all in front of me, and now So